Hello, welcome to our second annual lecture in drawing that the Trust founded in memory of Meline Cosman, who, as Mary said, thank you Mary, was a former student of the Slade. And she was at the Slade just before the war, and the Slade evacuated to Oxford, so she did her degree actually at Oxford. And it was an idea to found the lecture, one to be given every year, because we felt that drawing ought to be returned to general consciousness and to the fore of thinking about art. And we thought, well, what better place to do that than where Meline studied and where the Slade did and does put such an emphasis on drawing as a practice with painting and as an independent thing in itself. As Mary said, in addition to the lecture, we also found a studentship for students to do an MA in drawing, and Gabriel, the current recipient of that award, is in the audience, and I can't believe it, but their 2 years is almost up, so their degree show opens next month, and then in the autumn a new Meline Cosman Slade student will begin their MA in drawing. But tonight it falls my great pleasure to introduce Susan Owens, who, on the way here, I was thinking we've known each other, well, it must be more than 21 years, when we both used to live in Brighton.
It's longer.
I think it's longer.
It doesn't feel longer.
It feels like yesterday. And it's wonderful to introduce Susan, who knows so much about drawing, and it's particularly appropriate because she began her career working in the Strang print room here, before she then went on to be a curator of drawing at the Royal Collection, and then the V&A. She's now an independent scholar and curator. Her current book, just out, is on the front here. I'm afraid we can't sell them tonight, but we've got 25% off vouchers. Please take one, they're at the front, and you just scan them and you get the discount code. And Susan is going to be talking about Jonathan Richardson and Constable. And Constable is the subject, is it the bicentenary next year of his birth? So this year is all about Turner 250. Next year is going to be Constable 200. And Susan, if she's not busy enough already, has another book on Constable drawings coming out next year with Thames and Hudson, is that right? Thames and Hudson. So we look forward to that. So without further ado, welcome again, and welcome to the second annual lecture in drawing. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a real honour to be here. Thank you so much, Donato and team, for inviting me to speak, and especially with the connection with the Strang print room, the art collection at UCL, because that was how I first learned about drawings. Can I just check that everyone at the back can hear? Shall I? Is that okay? Right. Well, so it meant that when my first experience of being a curator was working with some of those amazing drawings which are at the heart of the UCL art collection, the UCL Art Museum now. Drawings by artists like Gwen John, Augustus John, Dora Carrington, Paul Nash, Wyndham Lewis. So those students at the Slade who were taught by Henry Tonks, and it's been referred to as a crisis of brilliance. And it was all about, so I learned about drawing being this very incisive tool for recording what was going on, what was in front of you, what was visible in the world. But something else, another purpose of drawing has become, sort of really come to the fore of my mind since I've been writing, well, when I was writing the book, which is drawing and the imagination, the places drawing can take you. Not about drawing the outer world, but drawing what's going on within the mind. And this is something that you can see around you in London now. Just go to the Courtauld and see the wonderful Henri Michaud exhibition, or go to the Royal Academy and the Victor Hugo exhibition. So these drawings which are very much about what's going on in the mind, extreme mental states, or drawing as this arena for experimentation. So I was very interested in the idea of drawing as these sort of twin poles of observation on the one hand, imagination on the other. But what I want to do this evening is almost look at something that happens in between those points, to see how they spark off each other. There's kind of fruitful territory in between those. So I want to focus on two artists, John Constable and Jonathan Richardson, born just over 100 years apart. On the face of it, they don't have a great deal in common. Richardson was a portrait painter, and as far as we know, drawing wasn't really part of his professional practice. No drawings that I'm aware of have come to light that he made in the process of creating a painted portrait. Constable, on the other hand, was an inveterate draftsman. He was someone who barely seems to have left home without a sketchbook, and his drawings form a kind of visual diary. So why am I linking these two? Well, both of these artists came to turning points in their lives when they found it necessary to take stock, to explore, to assess who they were becoming and who they'd been. They wanted to look back over the past and sort of shore it up for the present and the future. And both turned to the intimacy of drawing to do that, the sort of creative latitude offered by drawing. And what I hope is that I've certainly seen echoes between these two sets of drawings, even though they're very disparate, and I hope you will as well. So I want to start with Jonathan Richardson, 1667 to 1745. Now, I'll do a bit of scene setting because although Richardson was really famous, extremely well known, well respected in his day, when I mention Richardson to anyone nowadays, they don't, he just doesn't really have the name recognition at all. So he came from a humble background. He was the son of a silk weaver in London. And he was apprenticed after a time of being very unhappily. His father tried to make him be a scrivener. He got himself apprenticed to John Riley, the portrait painter. And in time, he got on with Riley very well, and in time, Richardson set up his own portrait practice and grew to become one of the most significant portrait painters of his day. So there are some leading cultural figures like Sir Hans Sloane, Richard Steele, Matthew Prior, James Thornhill, Alexander Pope, who was a really close friend of his. He was very concerned with the idea of elevating British art, which he felt just sort of didn't have a particularly good name. So he felt that British art really needed to be raised, and so he became one of the directors of the earliest formal art academy in England, the Great Queen Street Academy, founded in 1711. And he wrote these very influential books of art theory, an essay on the theory of painting, 1715, and an argument on behalf of the science of a connoisseur, 1719. And both of these books were very much written in simple, plain language. Richardson had this idea that everyone should be able to understand, everyone should be able to learn how to be a connoisseur simply by following some simple rules. So really interesting stuff. But he had a very interesting relationship to drawing because, as I've said, on the one hand, it doesn't seem at all to have been part of his working practice. He didn't, when he was producing oil paintings, he wasn't drawing. No sketches are known. But on the other hand, he was a passionate devotee of old master drawings, and he was one of the greatest collectors of his day. When, by the time of his death, he probably owned something like 5,000 individual sheets. And there were sheets of the calibre of this, the wonderful drawing now in the British Museum, Michelangelo. The 16th and 17th century Italian drawings were really the core of his collection. But he also had Dutch and Flemish drawings, this wonderful drawing by by Rubens, and that's one of his collector's marks, which if you just Google British Museum Jonathan Richardson, you'll get his own drawings, but you'll also get all of these wonderful drawings that he once owned, and it's pretty eye-opening, it's pretty staggering. Rembrandt was a particular enthusiasm of his, and in this he was very unusual. There weren't all that many collectors at that time, in the early years of the 18th century, who were very interested in Rembrandt, but Richardson was a bit of a guiding light there, one of his earliest English admirers, and that's his collector's mark again in the bottom corner. He had something like 120 drawings by Rembrandt, about 20 etchings by him. But after Richardson's death in 1745, his reputation just did this gigantic crash. On his death in 1745, George Virtue wrote that he was the last of the eminent old painters that had been contemporaries in reputation, Kneller, Dahl, Jervis, and Richardson for portrait painting. So at that point, he was still one of these really significant figures. But fast forward to 1771 and Horace Walpole, writing in his anecdotes, Walpole praised his ability to capture a likeness. He said he was very good at that, but then went on to say that he drew nothing well below the head and was void of imagination. And unfortunately, this rather stuck, this idea of Richardson as being a very stolid sort of painter. I have to say it's not entirely unjustified, but maybe it's certainly not helped by a mass of very undistinguished early 18th century paintings, portraits, which are almost routinely attributed to Richardson or Richardson sort of studio workshop when they appear on the market. So he's constantly being sort of dragged down by this. Now, Richardson himself thought very seriously about the role that portraiture should play. And he concluded that in a painting, what it should do is show the sitter in what he called a dignified pose, such as that they might adopt in a public assembly, and act as a sort of general history of the sitter's life. So when you think about it, it's actually quite a lot to expect of a portrait. But on the other hand, he was also very keen on this idea of elevating British arts, and he was a portraitist. So his idea was, if he can get portraiture to act a little bit like history painting, then that's at least half the battle. But later in life, this idea about what portraits could or should do came to play on his mind. And in 1728, when he was just about to enter this period of semi-retirement from active portrait painting, so hadn't fully retired, but he was on the way for it. He suddenly had more time on his hands, and he had more time to reflect. And he embarked at that point on this extraordinary series of self-portrait drawings. With this series, he explored aspects of his own self, he reviewed his past, he meditated on his own character. And actually, he demonstrated that he was anything but void of imagination. So as far as we know, this sheet, which is now in the Courtauld Gallery, was the first self-portrait drawing he made in May 1728. I think it's a very curious drawing because it's as though he's slightly guarded. There's a sense that he's almost standing back, so hesitating on the threshold of a door that he wants to push open but is a little bit uncertain about doing so. But over the next 10 years or so, he keeps on coming back to the door. He keeps on crossing the threshold. Sometimes for these drawings, he used chalk on usually blue paper. At other times, he used very small sheets of vellum and graphite. And these two can have quite a markedly different character. We'll look at some of each, but I don't really want to separate the two of them too entirely because I don't like too much tidiness in art history. But altogether, there are probably about 55 of these sheets known today, but I mean, who knows? I tried to work it out once, and I thought maybe he might have made anything up to 200, 250 of these drawings actually in his lifetime. As far as we know, the next drawing he made was just a few weeks later, in June of the same year. I think that is quite an interesting contrast to the first one, because it's very, it seems more purposeful. There's more of a penetrating gaze. It's almost that he's come a bit closer. He's kind of leaning in to it a little bit more. And I think this drawing really sets the mood of private reflection and self-searching, which you see unfold throughout the series of drawings. So yes, could just compare the two. He's really zoomed in on his own face. There's a connection, an engagement, a sort of commitment to the project. This drawing on this one was owned by Walpole, who bought it from at Richardson's son's sale in 1772. Richardson's son wrote an inscription on the back, which Walpole copied onto the front, and that's what you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And it's a quotation from the Roman poet Horace, and in translation it means something like, "When they retreat and hide themselves away from the crowd and the public eye." So this is very much the other side of the coin from the portrait as a kind of pose one should adopt at a public assembly. It's the opposite of that. It's almost as though what Richardson Jr. means by the quote is that they're stripping away, Richardson is stripping away this carapace, a public identity, and another kind of self is perhaps beginning to emerge. So the question that starts to come into focus is, what might drawing do, and where actually might this project lead in the end? Quite a few of these drawings are slightly annoyingly undated, so it's hard to establish an absolute sequence of them. This is one of them, but I think this is so interesting because you start to see not just this engagement, but almost more of a vulnerability with this drawing. He's come closer again. He's not wearing the soft cap, which men who wore wigs would normally wear at home. He's bareheaded. Also, the red chalk gives more of a warmth than the harshness of the black and white chalk. So it seems like a gentler drawing. But one purpose that we know about with these drawings was Richardson used them to assess himself, even to improve himself. He thought a lot about virtue. He wanted to become a better person. I'll come on to why I'm stating that so boldly in a little while. But below this particular drawing, Richardson himself has written a sort of slightly contracted quote, also from Horace. And what it means is, remember to settle the problem at hand with a level spirit. So this kind of ostentatiously sort of thoughtful pose, the whole drawing is a sort of note to self. It's Richardson saying to himself, don't rush into things. Remember, behave slightly differently or modify your behaviour. So the whole process of drawing becomes not just a way of recording himself, but actually a way of reaching this, becoming a better person, becoming wiser, becoming more resilient. Not all of them have this penetrating gaze. There are some that, like this, he was interested in drawing his own profile, almost as though he was trying to see himself from different angles, almost trying to see himself perhaps as others saw him, and perhaps the idea of the profile, and again he's completely bareheaded here, is a way of getting to part of his character that he didn't normally get to see himself. But so again, you get this sense of being stripped away and really trying to get at trying to get at something. You feel that the whole project is about searching. This, for me, is one of the most touching drawings from October 1735. Again, bareheaded, again you get that sense of vulnerability. And he represents himself here as a vulnerable elderly man, appearing to confront his own aging. I think even the way he's using chalk with this drawing is slightly more hesitant than we've seen in the previous drawings. It reminds me a bit of when you get a letter from a friend and you know their handwriting very well and you see for the first time a slight tremor in the handwriting. It feels a bit like that to me, a sort of hesitancy and uncertainty, a lightness of touch. But there's an extra dimension, well, to the whole project, but to this portrait in particular, because in the early to mid 1730s, so at the time he was going through this process of making the portraits, Richardson also began to write poems. He would habitually get up extremely early in the morning and he'd spend a couple of hours sort of shaping his thoughts, writing in verse. He said that it was a way of actually managing his thoughts, managing his ideas to write them in verse. He meditated on his own aging in his poems. He took his own moral temperature. He was always asking himself how he felt about things, how he should behave. He talks about how fast time was passing, what he ought to be doing with the day, how he ought to be using his time left. So it's a sort of exercise, but for the soul rather than for the body. And like the portrait drawings, they're almost always dated precisely. So every now and then you can match them up. And at around the time he made this portrait, between the 1st and the 2nd of October, he wrote a poem that was called Unconcerned for Outward Beauty. And a couple of lines from it are, decaying face or face decayed, thou shalt ere long in dust be laid. And it ends, ye features never much approved by me, nor made to be beloved, which now I, not regretting, view, no matter what becomes of you. As I say, it's hard to date the drawing precisely, but it is tempting to think of poem and drawing as a sort of double work of art, a deliberate double work of art. But as well as the chalk portraits, there were these graphite on vellum drawings as well. That he made. He started these, as far as we know, a little bit later, but they went on in tandem. And he did all sorts of different things. He was much more playful with these drawings. So in a way, just when you get the hang of the chalk drawings and think that he's really getting deeper and deeper and sort of searching for this kind of inner being, then suddenly he's doing a completely different kind of drawing at the same time. And in this example, making himself look very suave, very, very sophisticated. So here he's working with graphite. So of course this is before the late 18th century when processed graphite began to be made, which was much more responsive. You could get a whole range of different kinds of pencil. He was using the pure mineral, so it has this, it's much fainter, but it has this wonderful, really silvery quality. And this, in a way, it can be seen as a plumbago portrait, one of those graphite on vellum drawings, a little bit like black and white portrait miniatures that were very popular in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. But it's very odd. There's something very odd about this because he's looking off to the side and he's sort of very much posing, I think. So it sort of raises more questions than it answers. But what I think all the drawings do they investigate. There's a wonderful phrase from one of his poems, all my swift successive nows. So this idea of the self in a constant state of flux, moving from one thing to another. So as I said, I want to avoid this romantic idea of kind of really getting to the inner life, because that was so before that. I think that Richardson was thinking in a different way, and thinking about not so much digging deeper as catching himself on the wing as he changes, as time goes on. But with the vellum drawings, he also surveyed the past. He surveyed his own life. This is a self-portrait that he made in 1735, but it's copied from a self-portrait oil painting from about 1692. So there's this retrospective idea here as well, that he's not leaving that portrait in the past, he's bringing it into the present so it can cohabit with his other drawings. And so the whole project is about reflecting on the span of his life, perhaps his achievements. 1792 was a pivotal year for him because it was the year after his master Riley died, and it was the year before he married his wife, who was a relative of Riley's, and presumably just at the moment when he was setting up on his own with a portrait business. So that's a very key moment in his life. So it's like a catalogue of himself. He's cataloguing his own character and past. He could be playful with these drawings as well. This is a self-portrait he did as though he was a celebrated poet, so crowned with babe laurel. This is a copy he made for his own collection, but he actually made this one, the original, now in Cornell University Library, for a close friend of his, Catherine Knapp, with whom he shared what he called a poetical friendship. They both loved poetry, shared poetry, and there's a sort of joke going on about how she had this favourable opinion of his verses, which he knew wasn't very good. As I said, he was a friend of Alexander Pope's, and he once compared the venison of Pope's verse to the mutton of his own. But it's a sort of, there's an emotional dimension to this, because he was very proud that his friend liked his verse, but also there's a play acting going on as well. But as I say, I wanted to resist attempts to sort of categorise these two into very different groups, because I think that this is very comparable to to the profile portrait we've seen him doing in chalks. And in fact, it was very close in time. He made it just 2 days after the chalk portrait. So he's clearly working with one set of media or another in a slightly interchangeable way. But then on the other hand, just when you think you've sort of got a grip on Richardson, he does something slightly different again. So he returned to the subject of the profile, but this time he gave it a playful spin. So he imagined himself as he would look, his profile would look, if it were on the face of a coin or a medal, and idealized it. If you look at the one he did from life and the medallic one, it's quite idealized. And it sometimes gets more complicated still, because Richardson was deeply inspired by his own collection of prints and drawings. In fact, I do think there's a huge amount more to be done on actually comparing his own drawings with his collection. As I said, he was completely entranced by Rembrandt, and in fact, it's probably Rembrandt's example as a serial and an experimental self-portraitist that set him off on his own project. I'd be very surprised if it weren't. And in fact, this drawing, Christopher White has pointed out that actually it was made in homage to Rembrandt. So it's actually seems to be riffing off this particular self-portrait etching by Rembrandt, the self-portrait in a fur cap. It's the only time Richardson ever draws himself in a fur cap. But on the other hand, it's also a copy by Richardson of an early painted self-portrait. So yet again, it's very complicated. There's a lot going on with these drawings, and maybe not all of it is recoverable. Now, I puzzled over this drawing for quite a long time, this drawing in the British Museum, because it's so unlike his other chalk portraits. And also, it's not on blue paper, like most of the others. It's on white paper, but white paper that he's added a grey wash to. So he's clearly wanting to do something quite specific. And then I remember one evening just sort of Googling Richardson and the British Museum and drawings, as was my wont when it was this exhibition at the Courtauld I was working on a few years ago of Richardson's portrait drawings. And I suddenly came across this drawing by Bernini, or maybe not by Bernini, but thought to be by Bernini in Richardson's time. He used to own it, and he's written on the back, it's a self-portrait by Bernini. So what I think he's actually doing with this, rather as he did with Rembrandt, is looking at this drawing and making a drawing himself, almost sort of copying the drawing. It's quite unusual in the way that his eyes are going off to one side, his lips are slightly parted, his head is thrust slightly forward, very much as with the Bernini drawing. So I think there's this sort of, almost as though he was trying to inhabit Bernini's way of drawing. So, just to sum up with Richardson, he used drawing in really a wealth of complex ways to explore different identities and moods. And he obviously revelled in the license drawing gave him for this sort of playful informality, which he knew he couldn't do with painting. He looked inwards, he focused on his inner self in order to try to understand himself better, but also change. He wanted to become more virtuous. And as I said before, it was partly through poetry that, as well as portraiture, that he did that. But also he was looking outwards. He wanted to situate himself within this pantheon of great draftsmen of the past. Now, moving on to Constable, as I said at the beginning, on the face of it, Constable used drawing in a completely different way to Richardson. It was so central to his working life. Now, I've recently been writing, as Donato said, I've been writing about Constable, so I've been sort of going back to drawings that I had seen or knew before, but hadn't really kind of situated them in a timeline. And there's one particularly highly finished group of drawings that he made in 1817, which I knew them individually, and I'd always thought they were very remarkable drawings, but I just never really put them together. So rather like Richardson's drawings, although in a totally different way, when I looked at them again, they seemed to coalesce. They seemed to work together as another project of intense introspection and retrospection. Constable grew up in East Bergholt, a village in Suffolk, in southern Suffolk. His father, Golding, was a very successful businessman. He owned 2 watermills, a windmill. He owned land in the village, about 36 acres, that stretched out from behind the house. This is the house he built for his family, right in the centre of the village, calling it East Bergholt House. So the constables definitely arrived. And in 1792, Constable left school, and at this point, I mean, he wanted to become an artist, but his younger brother Abram was too young to sort of take over for the family business. His father, Golding, needed one of his sons to step forward and say, I'll be the apprentice. I will be the safe pair of hands. I'll take over the business. So Constable had this very strange 6.5 years throughout the 1790s until 1799, when Abram finally came of age and said, I will take up the reins. When at that point Constable was permitted to go to London and to study in the Royal Academy schools. But I think that 6.5 years was really formative for Constable, because during that time, it's a little bit unclear exactly what he was doing all the time, but certainly for some of the time, he was working in his father's mills. He was learning the business. He was getting his hands dirty. So he was really, as well as going out around East Bergholt and the lanes and fields with his sketchbooks, he was also learning about transporting grain up and down the river. He was learning about how to work a windmill from the inside, all of these rather extraordinary things for an artist of his generation. But East Bergholt continued to be extremely important after 1799, and in fact up until his marriage in 1816, which was when Constable was 40. So for all of these years, so even when Constable was living in London, that was only for some months of the year. He was had lodgings in London, but normally in about June he would go back to East Bergholt, where he would stay until maybe October, even early November, back in the family home. So for all of those years, he was deepening his connection with the place. He was sketching in the fields and woods. He was drawing outside. He was making oil sketches. So it was quite unusual for a landscape painter to behave like this, because most other landscape painters would take the opportunity that the summer offered once the Royal Academy exhibition was safely open to go travelling, to go to different places, to make drawings of different places, and to make those the basis of compositions that they would then work on over the winter. But Constable, not never, but he very rarely did this. He tended to draw and paint where he happened to be, either where he lived or where friends and family lived. So the result of this was that he spent all these bachelor years digging ever more deeply into a small area of Suffolk. And the result was an extraordinary emotional attachment to the place, and also that the landscapes, the places he knew, were infused by human associations. So when you look at, if you just turn the pages of Graham Reynolds' catalogue Raisonné, it's like a diary. You can sort of see more or less where Constable was so many days of his life. This is a sketchbook he happened to use in 1813, where he was making drawings of all sorts of things, from cows to long views to a man with a scythe. It was a sort of anthology of details. He described it to his fiancée, Maria Bicknell, as little scraps of trees and plants, ferns and distances, etc. And Constable was someone for whom no detail was too prosaic. So, for example, in 1800, he wrote to a friend of his back in East Bergholt. So this is when Constable is quite newly in London. He's getting used to being in London. He writes back to a friend who who was an amateur artist. They used to go out drawing together. And he says, "This fine weather almost makes me melancholy. It recalls so forcibly every scene we have visited and drawn together. I even love every stile and stump and every lane in the village, so deep-rooted are early impressions." I can't think of anyone but Constable who would admit to loving a stump in the village. It's this extraordinary level of detail. But here he is. This is a little sketch of timber posts he makes in the sketchbook in 1813, and then come 1824, when he's working on the Leaping Horse, there it is in the bottom left-hand corner. So these things are important. So until quite recently, all of this preamble is really to say that I'd had this impression of Constable, more than anything, as an artist who was fiercely objective, an artist who, well, as we know, certainly in his early years, spent his career responding to the appearance of natural forms, to transient effects of weather, to the sunlight falling on foliage. But this certainly isn't the whole story, and I increasingly realised that he used his work, and drawing particularly, I think, in order to express emotion. This is a wonderful group of fir trees now in the V&A that he made on the 2nd of October of 1820. Now, there's no way you could possibly see this, but right up in the top right-hand corner, he wrote an inscription that says, Wedding Day, Hampstead, October the 2nd, 1820. Well, what he actually means is wedding anniversary. It's the 4th anniversary of his very long-delayed marriage to Maria Bicknell. But it's so interesting that he chooses to make this drawing, this very highly finished drawing, to commemorate, to mark, to celebrate that particular day. It's almost as though and this is on Hampstead Heath, where he and his wife have lodgings at that time. So it's almost as though he's investing both the place and the drawing with emotion and memory. He's inscribing himself into the landscape. Now, I want to go on now to this group of drawings he made in the summer and early autumn of 1817, because I think this is where we get a sort of sustained and concentrated emotion. This was a very significant time for him because, as I said, the previous October, he'd finally married Maria Bicknell. And this marriage in 1816 separates his life into a before and an after. His whole pattern of life changes. So he's living in London full time now, rather than spending these long periods of time living back at home. So what happens in the summer of 1817 is that the couple who've been living in the Constable's bachelor lodgings, Constable finds a suitable house for them on Keppel Street, just north of the British Museum. But within days of moving in, they're on a coach bound for East Bergholt, and they'd stay there until late October. So it's this sort of pivotal moment in his life. It's the very last time he'd have this long period there. Maria was pregnant, so it was their first summer together as man and wife, but it was the last that they'd be able to devote to each other before children began to arrive, and many of them did arrive over time. So it was a precious time. It was an overlapping of the person and the place he loved the most. And the drawings he made at that time have a remarkably valedictory quality, because it was the beginning of something, it was the beginning of the marriage, but it was also the end of something. It was almost as though he was saying goodbye to East Bergholt with them. And these drawings are of a slightly larger scale than most of the sketchbooks he was using at this time, about 11.5 centimetres by 18.5. So they're a fair scale, and some of them are much larger as well. But he seems to have chosen each view rather than before, as you've seen with the sketchbooks, where he's going around and he's taking a view of this and that, whatever caught his eye. He chooses the views this summer with a real deliberation. Each one is a composition, each one is a portrait of a place. And this is the earliest one we know, which is 25th of July. It's an important place for him because it's just south of East Bergholt itself. It's on the Flatford lane which goes down to his father's watermill. So he would have gone up and down that lane an enormous number of times. But more than this is that gate, that's the junction to Fen Lane, which leads off down to Dedham, which is where Constable went to school. So this is the junction. One way he could go across Dedham Vale, and you walk along the river, go across a bridge and get to Dedham. The other way you get down to Flatford. So it's a kind of crossroads for him, a pivotal moment, a pivotal place. In reality, I went to look at this vantage point quite recently. In reality, there's a spectacular view over Dedham Vale from here. But you wouldn't really know it from this drawing. I just keep wanting to sort of crane my neck to look over those clumps of trees. You can just about see the land dipping away, but you can't really see it in detail. If you just compare it for a moment to these sketchbook drawings, when you get this linear clarity to a view, it's just not there. He's used a very soft pencil, one of the softest he could possibly have found at that time, to create very rich shadows, very, very hazy lines. It's sort of blurry. So it's not a drawing at all about detail. I think it's a drawing about feeling. I almost feel that he could have drawn this, a very important view to him, with his eyes shut. It's oddly enough, he also tried to make an oil painting of this scene, but it remained unfinished, and you just wonder why that is. It sort of raises more questions than it answers. And you could compare that drawing to there's a very famous pair of paintings of Golding Constable's, his father's kitchen garden, and his father's flower garden, it's gone completely haywire, the flower garden that he made in 1815, so just 2 years before this. This was another pivotal time when Constable was sort of saying goodbye to the family home, because his mother had died fairly recently and his father was ailing, so he was trying to capture the views. But they're so different because these just have a kind of ringing clarity. Every leaf is painted, but with his drawing of that particular spot down Flatford Lane is so different. And we know that he attached a great deal of importance to this drawing because he inscribed lines of Latin verse on the back. And thank you very much, Catherine, for supplying photograph for me when I was in need. In unusually careful writing, he inscribed words written by an English poet of the late 12th and early 13th centuries called Alexander Neckham, who became the abbot of Cirencester. And in this poem, he's describing the youth he spent among the monks of St. Albans. And translated, it reads something like, "This spot saw the day spring of my life, hours of joy and years of happiness. This place first tinged my boyish fancy with a love of the art. This place was the origin of my fame." And when, much later in life, Constable came to work on his great project of reminiscence and recollection, the Mezzotint series called English Landscape Scenery, he used these lines again, but actually underneath an image of East Bergholt House, where he was born, where he grew up. So in linking these lines to his drawing, I think he's kind of supercharging it with memories, with layers of history, with poetry, and with the Christian faith that was very, very important to him. Now, a week or so later, he visited another site and made another drawing, this one of a reaper passing a cottage on a lane. Now, it's harder this time to know what this site meant to him. It's simply, it's quite stark in a way, just this lane, very typically Suffolk scene, this man with the scythe trudging along. There's rain coming down on the right-hand side in vertical strokes. Again, he's used this very soft pencil, unusually for him. It's tempting to think that maybe it's a place of particular significance. We know that his and Maria's courtship took place in the lanes and the fields round about East Bergholt because she was the granddaughter of the rector of East Bergholt. You can, from the back of East Bergholt House, you can see the rectory. So when they met there, they would go for walks. And just to give you some context, one evening in September of 1814, Constable sat down by a window in East Berkholt House and wrote to her. She was away in London at the time. And he tried to tell her how he felt when he looked out at the landscape that had become their place, when every turn of a lane, every path in a field reminded him of her. And he said, "I can hardly tell you what I feel at the sight from the window while I am now writing of the fields in which we have so often walked. A beautiful, calm, autumnal setting sun is glowing upon the gardens of the rectory and on adjacent fields where some of the happiest hours of my life were passed." So does this drawing commemorate some particular stage in their courtship? Well, who knows? But I just feel that there's some kind of emotion in this drawing, and I can't quite get to the bottom of it. And again, 15th of August, between 6 and 7 in the evening, he made this drawing again of reapers in a cornfield, all pushing forward in this neat line. But again, there's a real sense of occasion with this drawing, not at all like the drawings of reapers he used to make when he was up there in the action. He's standing back, he's framing it. And of course, drawings like this were probably made on Constable family farmland because of those acres his father knew. He would have known some of the reapers by name. It's almost as though it was a way of kind of gradually retreating from their company, from being with them in the fields. And there's a serial nature to some of these drawings at that time as well, which actually reminds me of Richardson. He made a series of drawings of the church. Actually, these aren't, he didn't date these, but it's generally thought that they were made in 1817 as part of this remarkable group of drawings. They're extraordinarily detailed, specific, almost like an architectural draftsman's drawing of East Berkholt Church. And of course, this was a place that was immensely important to him. It was very near the house, right in the centre of the village. It was kind of, very much a place of huge significance to him. So there's another one here in the V&A, so the ruined tower from the south. It's as though he's approaching the church with a solemn intensity this time. It's not as though he hasn't drawn or painted it before. He has lots of times, but never quite like this before. It's almost as though he's just trying to get every stone, flint and brick down on paper. And this one, which is probably the most magnificent of all, it's almost as though by making these drawings of the church, it's a sort of parting gift or a tribute that he's making to the village that he knows and loves. And there's also a kind of desire, it sort of reminds me of Richardson drawing his own face from sort of different angles. He captures the same site from different angles. So he goes down to the docks at Mistley, which was a very important place for the family business, because that was where the sacks of flour that had been ground in the Constable mills would go to and be stored in a warehouse before being taken by the family's brig, the sea-going vessel, which would occasionally sail round to London. And I don't absolutely know, but I very strongly suspect that this is the family's own brig that he's gone down and drawn from the west. And then on the same day, he draws it from the other angle. He goes round the other side. And then, so there's this sort of autobiographical dimension to this. It's about, the drawings aren't just about his own emotions, they're about the family business as well, about the Constable family's place, activities in East Berkholt. And finally, in late October, when he'd almost completed his round of old haunts, he made one last drawing, but it was the most ambitious of all, this very large-scale drawing of elms in the park of Old Hall, which was the biggest house in East Berkholt. And this time he used at least two different grades of graphite to draw, so a soft one for those really deep shadows, but a hard silvery pencil as well for these silvery lines. And it's a feat of extraordinary sustained observation. Feel that every single leaf is being drawn. And this one has such a different quality to the others. It's got a very much sort of public-facing quality. And this is a drawing that he exhibited at the Royal Academy the following year. So these feel like drawings by an artist who's aware that his life is at a turning point, that he'd no longer have the freedom to sort of to wander and sketch like a sort of perpetual adolescent. While he was married and living in London, so it was this sense of saying goodbye, or almost bottling the atmosphere of the place with these drawings, so that in future he could uncork it and breathe it in and remember. And I'm not really suggesting that this is so different from his normal drawings, but I do think that it's a magnification, and it's much more intense than his other drawings, almost ritualistic. And there are all these layers of autobiography, so that you get youth, possibly courtship, the farm, the church, his father's business, all in these highly finished drawings. So it's like a cumulative self-portrait, but expressed through place rather than through his own features. Now, it's often said that there is this change in his Constable's style and his paintings after he marries, and he no longer has that direct access to East Bergholt anymore. And certainly the late Constable exhibition at the Royal Academy a couple of years ago demonstrated that wonderfully well. But I just feel that this sort of these 1817 drawings are a gateway to this new way of looking at the world, in which the sort of bright clarity and realism of his early work gives way to a kind of painting that's much more about memory and emotion and reflection. So a picture like the Hay Wain is so much about these different layers. It's very much a painting constructed in a winter studio, not in front of the motif. But I love the way that all of these, it feels like all of this emotion and memory binds these drawings together into a kind of notional album. So I just want to end by reflecting on sort of what these two different projects have in common. Well, both in a way were made in periods of huge personal change, almost moments of crisis in a sense, even though it might be a happy crisis for Constable. It was still a huge wrench from a way of life that he loved and that suited him very well. And for Richardson, it was quite an existential crisis. He was someone who loved to be busy. He wrote one of his poems is called Fill Time Well. You know, it's all about how to make the best use of time. So this idea of having time stretching away, not in this very regimented way with a portrait business, would have had a huge impact on the way he thought about the world. So both sets of drawings, I think, are about this kind of transition, negotiating transition from work to retirement, from bachelor life to family life. They're a necessary process of introspection, taking stock before going into this new kind of life. So they're about coming to a greater understanding of the self and about sifting and imposing order on the past to sort of shore it up as a platform to go into the next stage of life. And finally, both groups are at their core, they're intensely private, which is such a core feature of drawing. And they continue to fascinate me because they both raise all these questions that they don't really answer. They resonate with unresolved feelings and intentions. It just feels to me as though there's a real liveliness about these drawings. There's something ticking away just under the surface that continues to do so. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.